Hello, Sarah. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Councilor Pine. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good here. I have a face while we get going here.
Are you in month 2 yet
Month 2 of what? Sorry.
of this job?
Of CDNR, taking over CDNR. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
What were you doing before? Were you with the department or?
Yeah. Well, I got hired in CEDO in February, middle of February, and before that, I worked for the clerk treasurer's office for a few years before that. So.
Good. We'll wait a minute for Zariah to join us, and we have some participants signed up and have attending already. That's good.
I need to leave not too much after 7. I got another meeting queued up.
I think we should plan to wrap up. This is probably one of the most beautiful days we've had this year. So shooting to end by 7 is a good goal.
Yeah.
I have on my watch, I have 5:32. So I'm going to say we should, I'm just checking messages to make sure Councilor Hightower hasn't messaged me to say she's going to be running late. But let's go ahead and at least start with, is there anything about the agenda that Councilor Carpenter that you want added or changed?
No, I think we're okay.
Got it?
We're going to talk about next steps, so we need to talk about timing and future meetings and a whole bunch of stuff like that. But
yeah, I actually was thinking that perhaps the next steps might take longer than 5 minutes. So, but we can weave that into the discussion about just cause eviction. I think it's very much part and parcel of that conversation. Since there's 2 of us and we both are fine with the agenda the way it is, our focus tonight is, as the Community Development Neighborhood Revitalization Committee, is to focus on the just cause eviction discussion. And with that, I will open it up to public forum. I want to just say that members of Vermont Legal Aid staff have put together a pretty thorough discussion or review of the topic and requested time to present their findings. I would like to do that within just cause as opposed to within public forum, because I think it's very much a part of that. Perhaps there will be additional comments from folks from Burlington Tenants Union and Rights and Democracy and CVOEO, who are also involved with the just cause work effort that has been underway. So why don't we open it up to public forum first, and then we'll go from there to the actual discussion of the memo and the findings.
I don't have anyone lined up for public forum as of yet. If you would like to speak in public forum, you can use the chat function or the raise your hand function. But I did not have any calls or emails prior to the meeting for anyone wanting to speak in public forum.
Okay, I did just get, a message from Councilor Hightower saying she'll be on in a couple of minutes, so she's just about to join us.
Okay.
Sarah.
I was going to suggest, since I don't have a lot of time, and that we just launch right into having legal aid do their review. There may be some questions related to that, but
yeah. Okay, great. And now Councilor Hightower is with us, so let's get good timing. Perfect. If we could have the Erica, Devin, maybe as presenters now, if they're both ready and available.
Yep, Erica, I am moving over to a panelist, and
Devin.
Yep, And if there's anyone else you'd like me to move over to panelists, please let me know.
I think Jess.
Yeah, is Jess Hyman also on?
Yes, I can move Jess over now as well.
And is anyone from RAD and BTU that would like to be added as panelists? Raise your hand or maybe send a message.
I have Tom Proctor I can move over. He raised his
Great.
hand. Okay.
Yeah. And Christy Delphia from Burlington Tenants Union would like to be included.
Okay.
And then I think lastly, Jean probably might have some input on charter-based questions.
I'm sorry, Jean Bergman.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yep.
And what we will do is there will be opportunity for public comments in this agenda item, even though we've already sort of decided to move into this in lieu of public forum. We'll just weave it in as much as possible. So I just wanted to be clear that other people who are participants now just notify us, and you'll be brought in as panelists. Okay. Anything else from counselors on the committee?
Just, in terms of process, and Councilor Hightower mentioned charter, but, I want to, right this minute, we're going to focus on the legal aid stuff. And so I just want to make sure we get that done before we kind of morph over into the other stuff.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, Erica and Devin, take it away.
Well, thank you all for that introduction. I'm not sure this might be related to what we were just talking about, but our first plan was to open it up to Burlington Tenants Union because they had expressed that they had some stories that they wanted to share, and we thought that it was important that the City Council start with the perspective of the tenants who are living these experiences. So I think I see Christy on as a presenter. Christy, are you ready right now to start with that, or would you prefer for us to start with a discussion of the memo and loop you in afterwards?
I think you can go ahead and loop me in afterwards. That'd be fine.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thanks, Christy. Okay, Erica and Devin, that'd be great if you would do that. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you again for having us here and giving us the opportunity to speak in support of just cause eviction reform. As you all know, we're joined tonight by our partners, CVOEO, RAD, and the Burlington Tenants Union, who have been so helpful for us in developing the recommendations we're going to be presenting tonight. It sounds like everyone had a chance to look at the memo that we circulated last night. And with the time that we have, we'd like to briefly present some of the research we did and the recommendations. And our goal is really to give you all a sense of the existing legal framework around no cause, the problems that no cause poses for tenants, and how evictions, both formal and informal, impact renters. And we're happy to take any questions that you have. But at this point, I'm going to pass it to Devin to talk about the general landscape of evictions and housing in Vermont that led us to start thinking about just cause eviction reform and why we think that it's needed. So take it away, Devin.
Just a sec, Devin, before you do, Councilor Carpenter has a question, I think.
I know that the committee received a memo from you. Has that been posted? Is it available to the other participants, or is it?
It's on the CDNR City of Burlington site.
Okay.
Okay, great. Go right ahead, Devin. You're muted.
Oh no.
You're muted.
Sorry,
There you
trying to balance too many screens at one time here.
Right.
So let me just hop back over. So as you all probably know, in 2019, Vermont Legal Aid undertook a study looking at the causes and impacts of eviction. That study was mostly really focused on the non-payment issue. We did do a little bit of work to understand other issues beyond non-payment and how they interplay with each other. But in that study, we found that about 20% of filed evictions in Vermont are for no cause, which means that 20% of all evictions are situations where the tenants have done nothing wrong. They've paid their rent. They don't have lease violations. The landlord has just decided to end their tenancy. We know that that number of 20% filed evictions, we know that that number does not actually capture a significant number of the evictions that are taking place in Burlington and across Vermont. Because what typically happens, or what often happens, is that landlords will send a termination notice. The termination notice has a move-out date, and then tenants simply leave. Right, they move out without the court case ever being filed. So there's a big gap in our data because we can't ever track that. There, people often refer to that as informal eviction, and that's just something that's an unknown that we're just going to have to sort of try and wrap our brains around as we're going through the process. At Legal Aid, we have a lot of experience with cases, phone calls of people who call us asking for advice about these issues. We know that the impacts of eviction, whether they're filed evictions or informal evictions, we know that that can be devastating. And our research in the eviction report, and in addition to research that's been substantiated by studies done all around the country, show that evictions are absolutely devastating to tenants. They can lead to job loss. They can lead to relocation to neighborhoods with higher rates of poverty and crime. And the relocation tends to be particularly harmful to children. We know that evictions lead to poor public health incomes, including increased instances of depression and other mental health issues. And we know that when this happens within the family structure, this obviously really affects mothers and children. And the impacts can really last for years and years after the eviction. These are things that sometimes people don't recover from. And obviously, eviction can lead to homelessness, which is something right now we are working especially hard to avoid. We don't need to go into a lot of detail about the legal framework because we provided a lot of the detail in the memo that we gave you, but we just want to be clear that no-cause evictions are allowable under our state laws. And once a landlord files for an eviction for no cause, tenants have few or no legal defenses. Any defenses that the tenants do have are often impossible for them to prove. So what that means is that the court cases are pretty quick because there's really nothing tenants can do to fight eviction when that's the case, when it's no cause. Erica, do you want to talk about the next thing?
Yeah, that sounds great. So if you had a chance to look at the memo, you'll see that one of the major focuses in the work around just cause reform is fair housing. And we did that not only because we're fair housing advocates, and that's the work that we see every day, but because so many of our priorities as a city, as a state, and really as a country focus on how to support members of these protected classes. We've seen that that's been something that's been in a lot of city council conversations recently about how to best support people of color in the city. And our work and research show that when it comes to housing, we could be doing this work better. And one of the ways that we can do that is through just cause eviction reform. Our memo goes into more specific detail and statistics around housing discrimination than we're going to get into tonight. We'd just like to give you a high-level overview of our important takeaways. So some of the takeaways, we all know that tenants have rights to be free of discrimination in their housing. These are long-standing rights. Some of them have existed at the national level for over 150 years. And we know that as a society, we think that they're important and fundamental because they're so important to our state and to our city that we've reiterated these rights in state law, we've codified them in city ordinance, and we've even expanded them and added some protected classes that aren't in the federal statute. So we clearly think that fair housing is an issue that is important for our city, important for our community. But in the Housing Discrimination Law Project, time and time again, we hear from tenants whose fair housing rights have been violated. And time again, the law doesn't protect them from discrimination or gives them a remedy. And some of the blame for that falls on, based on our research, some of the blame for that falls on no cause. So we found that no cause evictions undermine and weaken fair housing rights in two key ways that we talk about in the memo. The first way is more straightforward. It's that no cause can conceal when evictions are actually motivated by discrimination. In other words, this happens when landlords evict tenants because they're members in a protected class. So because of their race, for example, family status or disability. But landlords are able to hide that that's the reason they're doing that by filing the eviction as no cause. They're not required legally to give a reason, so they don't. The other way that no cause evictions can undermine fair housing rights is that they destabilize long-term housing and they force tenants into a housing market where they are virtually certain to face discrimination. Our memo cites research showing extremely high levels of discrimination against tenants applying for apartments, particularly tenants of color and tenants with vouchers. Just a couple of quick facts. A study that came out this month, July 2020, by the Boston Foundation found evidence of discrimination against prospective renters of color in 71% of cases, so well over the majority of times that their testers of color applied. They have a harder time getting in the door. White testers were able to view apartments 80% of the time, while Black testers were only able to view those same apartments 48% of the time. And if the Black tester had a voucher, that number dropped to 18%. So really, really hard for people of color to even get a chance to apply for or see an apartment like relative to white renters. And the studies that HDLP has done in previous years in Vermont, the tests that we've done, have found really similar numbers here in Burlington and in the state. So when we understand that this is a problem, when we understand such high rates of discrimination against tenants at the application stage, it leads us to wonder whether no cause eviction is really something that is okay if fair housing is something that we're trying to prioritize. You know, we wonder whether it's really okay to demand that tenants of color and tenants of other protected classes, tenants with kids, tenants with disabilities, we wonder whether it's okay to demand that they leave their apartments and encounter this discrimination when looking for housing, when they haven't violated their leases or done anything that would lead us to think that this termination was expected. So in that vein, we'd like to share a few real life examples from our work in the Housing Discrimination Law Project of what cases where no cause eviction has led to housing discrimination and the impact that it's had on tenants. So I think Devin is going to talk about a case related to discrimination based on race and national origin.
Yeah, this is actually a Burlington case that we recently had where a renter of African descent with a large family was dealing with persistent harassment from her landlord. Her landlord would enter her apartment regularly without notice. When he was there, he would tell her things like, you don't know how to get medical care, or you don't know how to use appliances, or you don't use the bathroom properly because of where she came from. The tenant stood up to him about that a little bit, and less than a year into her tenancy, she received a no cause notice from the landlord. It took her, after she started looking for an apartment immediately after receiving the no cause notice. She actually took almost a year to find a place. This person had a large family, and also was a Section 8 voucher holder. So in addition to dealing with the day-to-day harassment that she was facing in her apartment, she was also every day out in the world while she was trying to find new apartments, facing discrimination in her housing search. She came to us over and over again in tears and frustrated, telling us, I found the perfect apartment. I think it's going to work. And then, you know, for any number of reasons, she was being told, oh, I'm sorry, it's not available to you anymore. You can't have this. And it was, you know, all at the stages of in the application. It was complicated by the fact that landlords often ask on their applications, have you ever been evicted? Or do you have an eviction case filed against you? And in this situation, because the housing search went on for so long, she actually did have an eviction case filed against her. So then that also makes it even harder for her to find housing, because the landlords will automatically screen out tenants on that basis. So she was being screened out for the eviction after that got filed. Before that, she was having difficulty finding the appropriate sized unit that she could afford with her voucher, and she was facing discrimination due to her national origin and familial status. This was like a quadruple whammy that she had going on. Fortunately, after about a year, she did find a place, but that's a lot of harassment and a lot of discrimination to endure when she was not at fault in the situation.
Thanks, Devin. And picking up on that, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the cases we've seen with discrimination based on familial status. Although, as Devin points out, there are so many cases, and we talk about this in the memo a little bit, where people are members of multiple protected classes, and that just makes things, as Devin shared, exponentially harder. So familial status discrimination is one of the most common complaints that we get. And one of the reasons for that, we think, is that landlords may be less familiar with familial status as a protected class. You know, it's pretty common knowledge that you're not allowed under the law to discriminate based on race, but having kids or intending to have kids is, I think, less well known. So the cases that we see tend to involve a landlord who tells their tenant, learns that their tenant is pregnant or intending to adopt, tells their tenant that they're not allowed to live there anymore, or that they can't get custody of their kid. And then when it gets to the point that they have to file an eviction notice, they go to serve an eviction notice, they go to their lawyer, and their lawyer usually recognizes that that's not a permissible basis for terminating a tenancy, and instead terminates it for no cause. And this has happened. I've been in the Housing Discrimination Law Project for a little more than 2 years, and this is I've seen this case many times. So a few quick cases that I've seen. I'm representing a client in a case right now whose landlord terminated her lease because she got pregnant. And the landlord was worried that the baby, who had not yet been born, would cry at night and disturb other tenants in the building. So our client had to move apartments when she was 8.5 months pregnant. And that was a no-cause termination. And she's since given birth, and an update that she's given me is that the baby sleeps through the night and is very cheerful and rarely cries. So that's a move that was unnecessary and very challenging for her. Another case we had where our client was told by her landlord that she would have to move out if she finalized her plans to become custodial guardian of a teenage boy. The landlord was annoyed that she hadn't asked him for permission before pursuing this process, and he believed that he had the absolute right to control who lived in his home because he owned it. And when our client confirmed that she was going to go ahead with the guardianship of the teenager, the landlord hired a lawyer who gave her a no-cause termination. And the last case I want to touch on briefly here, although as I said, it was not hard for me to think of these examples. There are many. Another complaint we received when a couple told their landlord that they would be becoming foster parents, and the landlord told them that he would not allow that because when they moved in, he quoted them a rent price and agreed to a rent price based on only 2 people living in the house, and not including any children that they might have. And the couple in that case was a lesbian couple, so it's possible that the landlord was not was exercising some other discrimination as well, and was not expecting the couple that he chose to have children in any way. And as I said, these are just a handful. We see many, many more. It's one of our most common ones. Another really common one is discrimination based on disability, which Devin has more information for us on.
Yeah, I think we probably get more calls on discrimination based on disability than probably any other protected status. And one of the most frequent situations we see is where a tenant has a documented disability. It may or may not be apparent, but they've requested an emotional support animal, and landlords who have a no pet policy have often take a very, very hard line and refuse to make the accommodation. This accommodation actually costs landlords very little. It's a very simple rule change that affects almost no one else, right? And tenants who require emotional support animals or service animals for their disabilities, they're responsible for damage to the unit in any way that any other tenant is responsible for that damage. And there's recourse that landlords have to recover for those damages. And so it seems to be particularly galling how often we see this denial for what amounts to very, very little reason. And we do often see retaliation for when people say are exercising their rights and they get the emotional support animals. We often see no cause evictions in close proximity to the time when they've requested or gotten their animals. Sometimes the accommodations are denied outright. Sometimes they're granted and then no caused. It happens both ways, but this is an extremely frequent situation that we come across.
Yeah, definitely. And although it's not, it's not the only situation where we see landlords preferring to issue no cause instead of reasonably accommodating or providing reasonable modifications, that those come in all flavors, and there are a lot of them. That's probably the most common one, and as Devin highlighted, the one that has the potential to have one of the lowest impacts on landlords, but it's something we see all the time. I also had a case really quickly. I also had a disability case recently that wasn't for an accommodation. It was because my client at the time, he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and had difficulty hearing, and the landlord wanted to shift the image of his property and his units. It was a multi-unit building towards younger tenants, and thought that my client, even though he was successfully living in the property with the help of case managers, he thought that my client, the landlord decided that he knew better and thought that my client would do better in senior housing. So it does happen based on animus against disability itself, and not just the reasonable accommodation piece. I also wanted to touch really briefly on discrimination based on voucher status, because that's, as we mentioned before, that is one of the most common sources of discrimination. And these are typically examples of cases I was talking about earlier. The second way that no cause evictions undermine fair housing rights is that they force tenants into a housing market where there's a lot of discrimination. It's less often that a landlord will choose to evict a tenant because they have a voucher after they've already rented them. Although I did have a case this past year where that did happen. But tenants with vouchers, we know that They already started a disadvantage in Burlington's housing market because it's a very expensive market and the vouchers are really hard to place. They have set limits on how much rent they can pay that are often lower than Burlington market rent. So they're already working with a smaller pool. And if a tenant with a voucher gets a no-cause eviction, it kicks off a housing search where they're almost certain to be discriminated against. And have their options even further reduced. These cases, sometimes I describe them as some of the easiest cases to prove and some of the hardest to fix, because unlike other claims, landlords often put in writing or tell the tenant up front, we don't take vouchers. We won't rent to people with vouchers, even if the voucher would cover the total rent amount. I can't overemphasize how common this is. Again, I've been in my job for a little over 2 years and seen it happen dozens of times. But because the Burlington housing market moves really quickly, the chance that a person with a voucher can respond to this issue effectively is slim to none. If a person with a voucher really likes a home, let's just assume for a moment that they are okay renting from a landlord who has already told them that they won't accept them because of their voucher, which is a significant question mark. Even if they want to continue with the process of renting that home, there's really no legal recourse that can, or not no, but almost no legal case that can move quickly enough to save that apartment for them. Another tenant will have taken that apartment, and the tenant with a voucher will be left, at square one. And it's also really hard, even if a tenant with a voucher successfully files a case, really, like for cases where a tenant with a voucher has a discriminatory statement in writing that, the landlord said in writing, we won't rent to you with a voucher, it can be really hard for the tenant to show that they were injured by this denial, because after all, it's one apartment. So, it's hard to prove to a court that a single denial is a reason that a tenant with a voucher is struggling to find a place to live. But the numbers that we see from the Boston Foundation study of this month that were published in the Memo show that tenants with vouchers, in almost 90% of cases, tenants with vouchers aren't able to visit the apartments that they want to see. They're screened out immediately. And so a single denial in writing may be just one denial, and it's hard for them to collect a significant payout for that. But all of those denials add up, and that's the housing spectrum that we see for folks with vouchers. And again, this isn't discrimination in application isn't a direct result of no cause eviction. The no cause eviction itself doesn't need to be discriminatory, but it does have an impact because it introduces instability into people's tenancies. It kicks off a search where a person with a voucher is by no means certain that they will find housing by the time that they need to move. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the question deserves to be asked: is this a cost that we're willing to put onto tenants with vouchers who already, in many cases, are already facing many obstacles to housing, often including disability or being single mothers with children? Is this a cost that we're willing to put on them for the sake of allowing landlords to have no cause? So that's why we raise this in this presentation as well. I wanted to really quickly touch on habitability issues. It's not our primary area of work, but it is something that we hear and encounter, that no-cause evictions where repairing a unit can be very expensive. No cause can create an incentive for landlords to evict the tenant who complains rather than undergo the cost of repairing the unit and making it livable. And even if tenants have a retaliation defense when this happens, which we go over in the memo a little bit, there is a state law that provides a retaliation defense if a tenant has reported a condition to a state agency, although it's not immediately clear whether the same protection applies if they report it just to their landlord. There's not a lot of resources available for claims like that. We see that in 75% of eviction cases, the landlord has an attorney and the tenant does not. That's from VLA's 2019 eviction report. And even if a tenant is able to get an attorney who will represent them in a retaliation defense for their no cause eviction, for them to effectively raise that defense, they've already had an eviction filed against them on their record, which makes it harder for them to get future apartments, as Devin flagged. So for tenants in that situation, the incentives for them to move rather than to take advantage of their legal right to raise this retaliation defense and fight the eviction are not strong. So that is, and that covers our portion of the presentation about the problems that we see with, we've seen for fair housing with no cause evictions. And I'm going to pass it back to Devin to talk about our recommendations for just cause.
Right. So we've been talking with partners a lot about just cause over the last couple of weeks. And I think we just want to be really clear that there are so many issues. We know so many issues that renters are facing in the housing market. And we don't believe that just cause is a silver bullet, right? We don't think it's like the one answer that's going to fix everything. But we do think it is a necessary undertaking if we want to have any hope of addressing other systemic barriers to housing, right? That this is this is like the foundation for building all of the other protections that are going to help address those barriers for tenants. And these recommendations have been vetted thoroughly with all of our partners, and all of our partners, so CVOEO, Tenants Union, and RAD have all agreed with this list. We came up with it together. So we think an effective just cause ordinance would cover as many landlords as possible. We would include mom and pop landlords and any kind of just cause ordinance that we think would be effective. We believe that in order for it to be effective, we have to define the scope of what constitutes cause very narrowly. So we would recommend limiting it to material breach of lease and non-payment of rent. We believe that an effective ordinance would require landlords to give written notices to tenants regarding any breaches of their lease, and would also give them the opportunity to fix those things and to improve their behavior, improve the issue that's been identified by the landlord. And just as an aside, that already exists for non-payment of rent. If tenants are behind on rent, landlords have to give tenants that chance to cure the non-payment. Just cause ordinance would also require landlords to inform their tenants about the availability of civil legal services or other resources if they were going to file an eviction for no cause, or for just cause. I'm sorry, not no cause. I had no cause stuck in my brain. And then finally, a just cause ordinance should limit the ability for landlords to achieve the goal of no cause through raising rent an unreasonable amount. We are not here today to debate what reasonable or unreasonable would be, but we do think it is an important concept, and we do also want to differentiate that from any kind of conversation that would occur around rent control or rent stabilization. We view this as a very narrow thing that would be much less major than that whole conversation. Sorry, I've kind of lost my ability to articulate that. But finally, we'd like to conclude this by recommending that CDNR advance a measure to the full City Council proposing a charter change that allows Burlington to enact just cause provisions in its code of ordinances. We already know that there's a lot of technical issues and legal issues to discuss along the way, and we've begun researching many of these things. Erica and I commit already to make ourselves available throughout the process to answer those questions and help think through any substantive issues that come up. We want to be clear, though, that those technical issues or legal issues that might come up should not be a barrier to taking action now to protect tenants. And we think that any of those questions can be overcome easily. Other jurisdictions have passed ordinances that work and that manage to balance the rights of tenants and landlords, and we think that we can accomplish that here in Burlington. So I guess we'll just finish out by saying thank you for your willingness to take this on. It's a complex issue, it's urgent. We are in the midst of so many crises right now, but we truly believe that this will help you advance both the cause of racial justice and also will aid in creating more stability in housing for a lot of renters, which is in this particular moment in time in the pandemic more important than ever. So thank you for taking this on. We're happy to answer any questions. I think before maybe we do that, I don't know, Christy, do you want to talk about some of the tenant stories that you got? Can kind of, that sort of ends the legal aid piece.
Okay, thank you very much. Christy, do you have anything you want to add to this conversation?
As far, well, I'm gonna let Tom tell the tenant stories, but for touching on a few things that Erica and Devin have been mentioning, as far as retaliation eviction goes, we've written parts into the CDNR that we had sent in, because if they find that a tenant has received a retaliation eviction, that's within the timeline for code enforcement. That's within 90 days of a report to code enforcement. And we've been finding that our tenants have been getting a lot of those, and they get no cause evictions served on them for those as well. Most of the time when we report those to the city attorney's office, as we are told, that's the process. They choose to use code enforcement themselves to do the investigating for those, and so many times and repeatedly we are told by tenants the investigations go nowhere. Touching on the situation with tenants with vouchers, they are right. If you receive a no cause eviction, they basically tell you move. But with the way that rents have been raised to such astronomical prices, the actual cap on what renters can pay has not changed in almost 7 years. So while rents are rising, those caps for what the Section 8 program is willing to pay has not risen. And we're lucky. I'm dealing with this right now, sitting here in this apartment. I've been looking for the last year because of the situation that we're dealing with here. We were given a no cause eviction, but it's gone into retaliation and now it's in court, but we have a Section 8 voucher. And again, looking for an apartment, if you go through everything with Section 8 and follow that guideline, they only give you 60 days to find an apartment. Now you go on Craigslist and you look for an apartment, and you're lucky if you get emails back. If you do get an email back and you mention that you have a Section 8 voucher, they will just tell you my apartment is not suitable for Section 8, or it's not rated for Section 8, whatever the excuse is, and the emails just stop. So finding an apartment other than having a voucher is virtually impossible because of the things put in place. And if you don't find an apartment in that 60 days by following that, your voucher is gone. And, you know, this is just absolutely unacceptable. Other countries across the world have done away with homelessness, period. Other states across the US have completely done away with no cause, because housing is a human right, or should be. Other countries have made it so. Other states have made it so. We need to make it so. And the only way to do that is to abolish no cause. No one should have that much control over anyone to say, no matter what, the excuse is, whether it's having a Section 8 voucher, complaining about the conditions in your apartment or house, having a disability, mental or physical, they should not have the right, period, to just tell you, oh, I don't want you here anymore. You got to leave. You know, it's unacceptable. And that's part of the reason why we as a union were formed, were complaints of no cause evictions being given to tenants for complaining about conditions in their apartments. So this memo touches on a whole host of stuff. And in the coming months, as we start hashing this stuff out, the legalities of it in parts will be defined a lot better. And I will hand it over to Tom.
Thanks, Christy. Tom, if you could just wait a second, I want to just ask Erica and Devin, is it the case that tenants living in certain types of housing now, and I'm thinking of what you broadly would call affordable housing or nonprofit or social housing, do they already have a just cause protection? Is that true?
Yes, so some of them do. So so broadly speaking, tenants who are living in properties that are funded by tax credits, often referred to as LIHTC or LIHTC properties, do have just cause provisions. And I believe, now Devin can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's also just cause in public housing, although there's very few pure examples of pure public housing in Burlington or nationwide nowadays. There's been kind of a national shift towards these tax credit properties. But that doesn't do much, unfortunately, for the many people in Burlington and statewide who have vouchers. I believe that certain vouchers, unfortunately, there's many voucher programs and they all have different terms and they're all in different places in the law. So it's very hard to generalize. But some of the vouchers through Section 8 funded by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, some of them have just cause provisions for the first year, but after that, the landlord gains back rights to terminate for no cause. So it's if we're talking about long-term housing stability within a community, there's really not a lot of protections for voucher holders beyond the first year. But yeah, you're right about the tax credit properties.
Okay.
Also the BHA managed properties, like Wharf Lane, Decker Towers, many of those properties do have just cause provisions built in and attached. They attach to the dwelling, they don't attach to the tenant. So if the tenant moves, they don't get to port those. Even if they're eligible for subsidy, they don't necessarily get to port those rights with them, right? So people who get into that housing, we always say never leave. Never leave your housing if you have that.
Yeah.
And that would also be true of properties like Northgate and properties owned by CHT generally. Would that be true?
Yeah, exactly.
CHT is very mixed because all of CHT's properties are not LIHTC funded. And I don't know if I should say this here. We actually found that some of the CHT leases did not have just cause attached to them when they should have been. We recently uncovered that. I don't know if I should say that right now in this meeting, but yeah. It's a problem that we recently discovered and have been working to remedy. But yes, generally LIHTC properties should have just cause.
Okay, thank you. That's just one factual thing I wanted to clarify. And Tom Proctor, give it a go if you would on the perspective that you want to share. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you, the Burlington City Council members, and also thank you, Devin and Erica, for what was a wonderful presentation. I know how hard those two have been working at this, and just working with them has been absolutely phenomenal. So thank you. I wanted to share with you a few tenant stories that have come to us anonymously. As Erica alluded to, there is a lot of discrimination in evictions, not just for why you get evicted, but after the fact. and trying to find new housing. And so a lot of people aren't very comfortable sharing publicly and anonymously their stories about why they got evicted. I'd also like to say that the stories that Erica and Devon shared are heartbreaking and just show a small percentage of the stories that are actually happening, because these are the people who have gone to legal aid, have had either the wherewithal or the knowledge to be able to go and reach out to that service. For many people, it's just not the case. Many people don't have the time. And so this is happening far more than you can imagine. And for the most part, those stories just go unheard because a lot of people will just leave and not challenge landlords when they get an eviction notice, either through not knowing what their rights are or just, you know, not being able to fight it. So I wanted to share a few stories, and then I've also got on the meeting, I believe we've got we do have a tenant that's willing to share her story, Brenda Brazier. So once I share the stories we've got, if you do see her in the participant list, it'd be great if you could unmute her and she can share her story as well. But these are a few stories that just come up when we put out a request to hear a few of these stories. Thank you for Christy for getting them together. One person said that they were living in an apartment, and the landlord said that the city required to make an extra parking spot. And because they had to make an extra parking spot, they had to demolish their porch and build a new door on the other side of the apartment. They had no way of verifying that. They had no way of knowing whether or not the city had made the request to create an extra parking spot, or if it was just an excuse. Either way, the person got evicted. Again, it was no cause, and had to leave their apartment. For another person, they were living in an apartment for 5 years. A new neighbor came to live next door to them and complained to the landlord about what they didn't know, but they were having a problem with the tenant that was been there for 5 years, and the landlord decided to evict that tenant. And again, there was no way to fight back in court. That person just had to get out. Another person shared with us that they rented for 1 year from the Bissonnettes, and they were evicted despite, so they were evicted because they were late on paying their rent, which happened more than once, this person readily admits, but they paid late fees, and they always paid the late rent in full, which is allowed when you are evicting for non-payment of rent, as long as you do pay full rent. And I may need to fact check this with Erica and Devon, who definitely know this better than I, but if you pay full rent within, before you get evicted, you should be allowed to stay in your apartment. And the Bissonnettes decided to get rid of them, I'm assuming because they found them problematic. So these are just a few stories that we've gathered. As I said, there are thousands more, at least hundreds around Burlington. And a lot of these are never going to get reported because we're just not going to hear them, or the people that have them are too afraid to come forward in case they get discriminated by landlords in the future. With that, I'm going to pass this over to Brenda, who has also got a story, who is being incredible and sharing with us tonight.
Go right ahead, Brenda. You're muted still. If you could unmute yourself on your computer.
I'm talking and still muted. Okay.
Yeah.
So I rent here in Burlington with my granddaughter, and 2 years ago we got an inclusionary apartment, and I have a voucher with VHA. So the first year of living here, there was a lot of problems, and there was actually an article written, the Exodus article with 7 days about this place. So when it was time to renew my lease, I was told by the manager that I wouldn't have a rent increase. Then Kim Chewing Her supervisor said I would have a rent increase, and I argued no, because I was told I wouldn't. So they emailed me that they wanted BHA to pay their portion of the rent increase, but then they would reimburse me that portion of mine. And that's illegal. And I told them no. 6 months later, I get a notice to vacate for no cause. So this is where we're at. And this occurred in January, late January. So then BHA closed in March due to COVID-19, and they weren't doing any inspections. So I could not look for a place to move by June 30th, which was the end of my lease. I notified Redstone that I wouldn't be moving by June 30th because I only was given 3 weeks notice that I could start looking for an apartment. And July 1st, they doubled my rent. So, because if you don't do a 1-year lease renewal with Redstone and you choose to go month to month, then your rent is doubled. So now, as of July 1st, I have the $1,115. Then they charged me another $1,115 because now I'm moving to month because my lease wasn't renewed, and then charged me a $50 late fee on top of it. I've tried to reach out to HUD and to the Burlington mayor and to Bernie Sanders, who actually gave me a referral to Vermont Tenants Union, but they couldn't do anything to assist me and my granddaughter because of the no cause. But there was cause. It was retaliation, and it's unjust. And I have my granddaughter, who's lived with me since she was 5, and we've had the vouchers for 7 years now. I'm having difficulty finding a nice apartment. My granddaughter, she has complex PTSD, and having a safe home is very important. And to find a safe environment in Burlington is difficult with the housing that you get under a voucher, the dollar amount. And then my experience in me applying for other places that are at the maximum of what my rent can be, they're not calling me back and they're not emailing me back once they find out that I have a voucher. And it has been a horrible experience. It's very real, and I'm not a minority, but I could imagine those that are, theirs is worse than myself. And, you know, that really needs to be considered. That's it, really.
Thanks, Brenda. Thanks for sharing that with the committee, and it's certainly helpful information to have. There was a attendee, a participant, Larry Miller, asked to be recognized. So Larry, you can unmute yourself because I believe you're now a panelist and you can speak.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Right ahead.
Okay. I spoke at the last meeting, and I'm a property owner. I own 3 rental properties in Burlington for a total of 7 apartments. I've lived in Burlington since the end of since '96. I see both sides of this argument. I'm not going to get on here and just be angry as a landlord and say, this is ridiculous. But again, I have to emphasize that we have essentially three groups here on this city committee meeting, and no landlord representation. No one speaking about from the landlord or property owner perspective. So that I find very concerning. And for every single story that Erica and Devin came up with, and Tom, I am sure I have my own stories, and I am sure that out of all the landlords in Burlington, we could come with plenty of stories if landlords were actually included in this to give a completely different perspective. So that I want to preface it with that. The systemic racism and discrimination and the disability discrimination, it's unacceptable. I get that. It's a problem in our society. It's a problem everywhere, obviously. I don't condone it. I see it. I can imagine it's going on in Burlington. I also, Vermont Legal Aid, you are coming at this and you're telling stories. But if you were telling these stories in a court of law and you had opposing counsel coming after you, they would ask you so many questions that would probably destroy every one of your cases, because you're not hearing, no one's hearing the other sides to these stories. I know you're smiling, but the reality is, what is the landlord's stories to these? I accept that I'm sure a number of these stories are totally legit. And I said in the last meeting that I know there are bad landlords out there, and I don't condone that. But everything that you guys are proposing, there are going to be unintended consequences of what you're suggesting. So if you have rent control, if you have ban the box, if you have no cause evictions, it's very clear from my perspective that landlords are going to be even more picky about anyone that goes into those apartments, because they know that they can't get rid of them, or they have rent issues in terms of covering their expenses. So the discrimination or the blocking of people going into apartments is even going to be greater than it is now. If you don't see that coming, I mean, it's very clear to me what's going to happen. You say that 20% of the evictions are no cause. What is that per year? What is that out of all the apartments in Burlington? How many people, I mean, you're throwing statistics out. I'd like to know a little bit more detail about those statistics, because if the CEDO report listed a certain number of evictions per year in Vermont. What is it in Burlington? What's no cause? And what is the other side to all those different stories? I mean, I can give you a couple stories. I had a tenant who out of the blue needed an emotional support dog. And I called Vermont Apartment Owners Association and I said, or Landlord Association, I said, what's the story with this? Because there are hardwood floors in that apartment. And I could just imagine some dog destroying the floors. And there's no way I would ever get compensated for that if it happened. It may not have happened, but that was my concern. But I never said you can't have the animal, and I never said you need to leave. The woman ended up leaving on her own. It had nothing to do with me. She just, it had to do with her roommate. But again, these are concerns in my head, because I'm thinking, what is the possible cost to me for doing this? Because there's a limit on, or pet deposit. You can only sand down floors so many times before that's done. Before you have to replace the floor. These are the thoughts that were going on in my mind, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't discriminate. I had, in that apartment, the first time I rented that apartment after renovating the house, I had a Section 8 tenant. And she was great in many ways, but she had a neighbor said to me, there's a lot of traffic going in and out of that apartment. And I was working outside one day, and there were a couple of guys in there when she wasn't even home smoking, and there's no smoking allowed on my properties. And there were a number of things that she was doing that was violating the lease. I called the Section 8 people, and they were very understanding of where I was coming from. And they said, here's what you can say. And I sat her down and I said, here are the different issues that I'm dealing with. You have the potential, I will not renew the lease, you know, if these things are not corrected. And she did correct them, so it was fine. But had she not corrected them, I would not have renewed it. I had a story of some tenants that were smoking, you know, and again, no smoking. The ad says no smoking on Craigslist. The lease says no smoking. They were smoking. I gave multiple warnings, and I still walked in when I had to go code enforcement. I couldn't even walk in the apartment. The pot smell was so strong. I chose not to renew the lease. I didn't go through any eviction process, but had I gone through an eviction process, they might have said, well, we're not smoking anymore. We stopped. At that point, the trust is gone. I don't trust them. They've smoked in the apartment. They've smoked outside the apartment. There was a can full of cigarette butts. You know, I decided just not to renew the lease, but I guess maybe that wouldn't be allowed, or it would be allowed. I don't know. But these are, you know, they're, in the last meeting, there was a person calling up about their neighborhood and all the problems with the people, I guess, renting in the neighborhood. If they're not breaking the lease, but they're a nuisance to neighbors, and you decide not to renew the lease, well, I guess under no cause, you can't do that anymore. You know, if there's, I mean, all these different proposals coming out, there's just so many different stories and dynamics that I feel like you guys are not even thinking of. Like if Erica or Devin, if you had a partner and you had 2 kids and you have a 2-family home that you saved up for and got, and you're going to rent out that other apartment and you have your children there, you're going to be really careful. I think that I'd be willing to bet that you would discriminate on who you're letting into that apartment. And you would be struggling with the idea of if that person was a problem tenant, but not breaking the lease, and what you would do because of your family or your neighbors. So there are a lot of different dynamics, and I just feel like you're not thinking of a lot of these, but and again, the big issue for me is that you're not really getting the input and all the different stories from landlords. And you said it was all, your proposals are vetted, but only among you guys. And that's a fundamental problem to me. So that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Larry. The thing that I just want to add is this is a process to get input and feedback and hear these examples. We're not concluding this process tonight. This is a beginning of a process. So there will be far more opportunity for discussion. We just wanted to get the information that was gathered by people who spent a lot of time on it out on the table so that folks could, you know, hear it, understand it, get their own reaction, all of that. So Councilor Carpenter, I just want to recognize you.
I was actually going to say the same thing. As I prefaced, the goal tonight was to simply review the memo and the work that had been done on that. I did have a conversation today with Angela Zakowski from the Vermont Landlord Association, who's on the call, and invited her to participate and pass that on to Councilor Pine. So I expect they will participate in a future meeting. I think there's a half a dozen organizations probably around about the county that we need to hear from that we haven't scheduled yet. So this is sort of the first on the schedule to hear from folks.
Great. I just want to say we have a few people who've.
You're muted.
You just muted yourself, Brian.
Leave your cursor there long enough, it mutes you. We have a few people who've indicated they want to speak, and so we're going to recognize them, I think, in the right order. If I mess it up, I apologize. I'm not a pro at this. Go ahead, Carpenter.
I just, I can go either way. The goal tonight was to get out the work that Legal Aid and RAD and BTU did. We've got to talk among ourselves around next steps in process. So I just want to make sure, and it's 20 minutes to 7, so that we have enough time. You know, we had wanted to set aside some time so that the committee itself could figure out what its work plan is going to be going forward. So I'm just trying to sort of distinguish that from general public comment and make sure we have enough time for the work we've got to finish in the rest of the hour.
That's a point well taken. I would just ask the people who are queued up now, who are ready to speak, keep it brief. Keep in mind that we have we're going to have other opportunities. There will be further discussions as a committee, and we do need to do a little bit of committee work as well. So go ahead, and I think it was Jean Bergman, Sandrine, and I believe Mayumi put her hand up as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, members of the committee. Let me first say that I have represented tenants at the rent escrow hearings that Legal Aid and Lawline have established for unrepresented tenants. I can tell you that I saw far too many no-cause evictions in that process. And that's at the very beginning process that included, because it was a rent escrow hearing, complaints for non-payment. We wouldn't be there otherwise. But these are throw-ins and I have actually had cases which were, there was real good defenses against the non-payment, but there was nothing against the no cause. As the code enforcement interim director in 2004 and 2009 for the city of Burlington, and for as the city's housing prosecutor for 20 years up to June of 2018, I saw far too many substandard units. And I believe that a fair number of those in the non-student housing, which turn over every year, but in the ones that are in the quote unquote community, that people don't complain due to a fear of being evicted. It's my experience. I believe that the existing ordinance, and you have the white paper from the city. So these are, just cause is mentioned, but these are supposedly great things that we've done. And I think we have done good things. I participated in many of those for the last 40 years that I've been involved in the housing issue in the city of Burlington. But we've got existing ordinances on discrimination and retaliation that I believe, based on my work both inside and outside the city government, are ineffective deterrents. And one reason is that those ordinances require prosecution by the city of Burlington. Christy talked about, the investigative process, but I can just tell you, I am not aware in the 20 years that I was a city's prosecutor of ever having a case brought to our office to prosecute for retaliation or discrimination. Though the Vermont statute allows tenants to use them as defenses to evictions, including no cause evictions, but those are rebuttable defenses. And so it becomes very difficult. And in a system, and I can tell you that the city of Burlington will not bring to the table enough resources to give all of the tenants who are unrepresented sufficient legal representation. And I doubt very strongly, based on my volunteer lawyer experience, that the state of Vermont is going to pony up that much money. So you are looking at people who are severely disadvantaged in dealing with that system. Mr. Miller made, I think, some compelling points for why cause eviction, where just cause eviction comes to play. But I can tell you, every story that he gave, every horror story, was a just cause that could be brought, not a no cause eviction. And they don't get brought any quicker if you say no cause. I mean, it just means it's a less of a pain in the ass to fight. But this is a business. And it's a business for the landlords, and it is a house. And if ever we have seen, if ever you, as elected officials, have seen the need for a house, we have seen it for the last several months. So this is really critically important. Let me just end with two quick comments about charter change. You know that just cause, and for those who don't know, because you're not inside, a charter change is required to bring just cause eviction to the city of Burlington. Absolutely. You can spend a gazillion years. You still then have to go. And so the real question, if you decide to go this route, is what track you take. There's two tracks that you can take. One is a simple language, enabling language. And you would look in Charter Section 48, and an example of general language is the one my scratch. I think it's 20, but it could be 28. I'm sorry. On 48, subsection 28, on the keeping of animals, and that's an example where it says that the city can regulate the keeping of animals. And what we did was then write the urban agriculture. You can keep chickens and goats and all that stuff. It's a massive ordinance that I helped draft with Jess Hyman. I think Jess was in that group among other people. And so that's an example where you wouldn't put a 15-page ordinance in the charter. That would make no sense at all. And then you can, depending on how narrow you want to make the law, you can make specific language. You could actually put that in. And an example of that is found in Section 48, subsections 64 and 65, which are the provisions around the notice to quit and the rent hike notice. And I think Brian was on the council at that time when those were brought forward, and that's specific language. So you've got those choices as to what to do. My own recommendation, and I'll end with this, is in light of the detail that both legal aid and at least one landlord, Mr. Miller, indicated, that specific language is, I wouldn't recommend it, because the details, the amount of details that has to go into is particularly difficult. That is not to say that you shouldn't be working out details and understanding what that is, about putting out that in the context, about sharing that with the legislature, but that is also prone to being changed in the legislative process. And I end with that.
Thank you. I would just add that as a young tenant activist 32 years ago, I fought for just cause eviction. We brought it to a question in November of 1988. We won at the ballot as an advisory question. And then a few months later, we brought it to the voters in March of 1989. However, in that election, the voters were persuaded by the sort of owner interests of those who own rental property, that we were asking for too much broad authority because we were just looking for enabling language, and we were essentially, the word blank check or pig in a poke was what they kept using. And ultimately we lost that vote. And I think it was largely because of the fact that we offered very general language that was enabling. So I think there's a downside to that approach as well. But we have
there's no doubt that that's a political calculation that you need to address. You can go either way on that, and you can perhaps cut the baby in half in terms of details that give you a basic framework, but don't get into the absolute bloody detail, because that becomes particularly difficult in a vote context.
I know that Sandrine wanted to speak. I know Councilor Carpenter keeps putting her hand up, and I know she has to leave at 7. So can it be quick, Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Gene if he could essentially send us that, or a little more in writing, a little draft of those two options.
Reduce your comments to writing. If you
I can put them in writing. It'd be my pleasure, Councilor Carpenter.
Thank you. Sandrine, I think you've been enabled. If you could.
Yeah, Sandrine, she's calling in, so you should be able to speak now.
Yep.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
I would be brief. Thank you very much to give me the opportunity to speak today. I want to thank Erica and Devin, Todd, and Christy and Jazz for this work. I think that the outline of this memo has brought to the surface, the issue of vulnerable population that actually facing pretty much homelessness. And one family facing this type of situation is one too many. I do think that this is the beginning of the process. I do agree that both parties and the tenants and tenants advocates and the landlord and landlord advocates have will be able to have the opportunity to speak to it, and we will hopefully get to some type of a protection for tenants, because being asked to leave for no fault on your own, although some landlord has the right to say and speak of, situations that do apply for such a practice. But I do not think that this endeavor that we are taking, this initiative, should be just brushed under the rug because it's only 20% or even 10%. I do think that going forward, we will have the opportunity to speak a little bit more and advocate for tenants, and then not will have the opportunity to do so. And I hope that we agree on going forward for the benefit of the whole community. This is all I will say at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandrine. And Mayumi Cornell, are you on? Christy had said she had raised her hand. I just want to see if...
Yep, she should be available here as a panelist.
Mayumi, if you're talking, we can't hear you yet.
I don't see what happened to her, and my apologies, that might have been my fault. Hopefully she'll hop back on, but
okay.
I don't see her on right now.
Okay.
Oh, here she is.
Her
I'm
hand
sorry,
is
yes.
raised. She's still there as a participant. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, she should be coming on as a panelist. There we go.
Mayumi, you're on.
I just wanted to speak to my experience. I was born in Burlington. I've lived here pretty much my entire life, except for a few years. And I gotta say, I've never had a no-cause eviction, but I've watched it affect my friend. I've watched how it affected her son. And, he is now incarcerated. She is homeless. She has been homeless for nearly 3 years, from my understanding. And I just got to tell you, the human toll is horrific. It's horrific to watch someone that I care about struggle that much. And, this is my godson, and watching him struggle with all these issues. And I think it all stemmed from the fact that they became homeless. And I just got to say personally that my experience in renting has been good and bad. And I just hope that we can have some agreement so that tenants can have some more protection.
Thank you very much. Committee, we have about 10 minutes, maybe slightly less. I would love to hear from both committee members how you want to proceed on the timeline that we have in front of us. Not just tonight, but I mean in weeks ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think, I hope that we are still planning on having a meeting on, I think it was the 27th. Yeah, where, if we think, and I think I heard that there were other voices that need to be heard. I think we can bring those voices in on the 27th. I'm hoping, I feel like I have enough information that I would like to, that I'm thinking about next steps in terms of referring this to charter change, getting some language around what that looks like. So I'd like to see us move forward and get to the point, gather information over the next 2 weeks to where the point we can make a decision on the 27th, in whatever direction that may be. And yeah, I think I might leave it at that for now. That's kind of my objective and what I'm thinking.
That's helpful. For both counselors, I had a list of questions that I shared with you. Counselor Carpenter sent a few. If we could sort of package these together, and my sense is that they would go out to the folks who've been working on this, and to include representatives of rental property owners in this discussion. I think that would be, open this up and certainly invite those perspectives, because I think it's important that all those perspectives are considered and are included in this deliberation. So Councilor Carpenter, your thoughts on that?
I still continue to feel that we, well, first of all, I again want to acknowledge that we need to hear from other people. So I think that's very important. And then having said that, we need to talk among ourselves strategically what we want to go. I respect Councilor Hightower's push to want to do this for this election. That's not necessarily needed. I think there's different paths we can go, and why I asked Attorney Bergman to send us in writing makes a significant difference to me. Whether we're asking a more generic enabling question of the charter or whether we're asking something very specific, really sets the path very differently. I have many questions if we're going the route of specific. There's half a dozen model no-cause eviction statutes around the country that we could and should look at. There's different components about who's in, who's out, the different terms. And I feel not at all comfortable going to charter change without having vetted that, if that's the route we're going. If we're going in another route, then I certainly could look at it very differently. So I think next meeting, we need to maybe schedule more time. We clearly need to hear from some other groups. And then I think the three of us need, pick an amount of time, an hour, to talk about it. We might want to invite Attorney Blackwood to join us if we can, because I think, again, and I'm just new to this, how this interplays with ordinances and charter, eludes me a little bit. So I need a primer on what it is we're gonna potentially recommend and which path it would go, depending on which way, what we recommend.
Great. Okay. In light of the time tonight, what I would like to suggest is that we convene on the 27th. We hold a really open discussion, again, with anyone who wants to participate, of course, but that we open that right up for the discussion on the 27th. And we, in that meeting, plan to try to get answers to questions we have as counselors by sending those in advance, around issues like, the issue that the folks from Legal Aid mentioned, which is you have to have some provision in a just cause eviction measure that ensures that you can't just circumvent the ordinance with a big rent increase as a way to essentially evict through a rent increase. But yet we don't have the ability to enact rent control. So that issue came up repeatedly in the debate 30 years ago. That was the huge issue. And that's the kind of issue I think we have to grapple with a little bit.
And I think we're going to have to revisit carefully, because I think if you go the route of more enabling now, which has strategic issues, that does not have to be decided.
True.
Today. If we go another route, then a lot of things need to be decided. And so, there's a plethora of things that we need to talk about. So I just think that's the strategy, and that really affects the discussion. And I think I'm feeling very under-researched on if we go the more specific route. There's a half a dozen, 2 dozen things that could be, what do you do with owner-occupied housing? If you want a rent cap, what do other communities do? What do you do about nuisance violations versus material violations? There's just a lot of questions. So I think that's the strategic discussion we need to have.
Yeah, Councilor Hightower.
Yeah, I don't think that I have like a strong need to have it on this ballot. I just think that we tend, as council, as politicians, we tend to like to navel gaze and think about it a lot. And if we don't have a compelling reason to wait, I don't see a reason to wait. So that's where I'm coming from. If we have a compelling reason, that is fine with me. And the other thing that I would say is I think that we're talking about this as a binary right now, like, oh, do we have like very broad language, or do we have, it sounds like almost the ordinance fleshed out. And I would suggest that probably neither one of those are or should be the case, and that we probably need to have something in the middle. And then the third thing I would say is it's also not our job to completely come up with the charter change language. I think we might want to give the charter committee some flexibility and having an opinion in that as well. So I think we want to give them some recommendations and some things that we've thought about from kind of the CDNR perspective. But I would also strongly caution against trying to write the whole ordinance language by ourselves at this time, when I think to some extent we do need to get the process moving and get some public input for that specific part, whereas I think that is less true for some of the charter change language.
Okay. Councilor Carpenter, do you have something in your hand?
Well, I mean, again, I think it's this tension and this back and forth, and we just really need to have that discussion. And for me personally, since we are the Community Development Committee, I want to really understand whatever it is I'm recommending. I personally don't feel, I mean, the Charter Change Committee is not the Housing and Community Development Committee. Their job is to look at a framework and what you put on a ballot. It isn't to really deal with the substance, it's to deal with the form. And so I want us to be really have the robust discussion on the substance before we send anything to another committee.
Yeah, I share that view, having been through this process quite a few times, both as staff and as an advocate and an activist, and then as a counselor. So this is familiar territory. It's very squishy. It's not going to be clear cut, and we're going to come to a point soon where we have to make a decision up or down. Do we put a general question on that just says to the voters of Burlington, shall the city council essentially enact legislation that regulates this issue? And then we know that there's a green light on it. That's one way, just really broad. And then we come forward with a specific, proposal. So that's another option. So we have reached the hour. I think we said at one point we should have a longer meeting, and that should have been tonight, but we didn't do that. So can we commit to the 27th, go for 2 hours, maybe 5:30 to 7:30?
Can we not put a time limit on it just in case?
Yeah, sure. I would actually prefer to do that. And
do that.
We're not very good about giving ourselves breaks.
Yeah.
But I say 5:30 to whenever, maybe around 7, we get a good 15-minute break and
sounds good.
Get a snack, but
Okay.
something like that.
I've collected about 6 or 8 questions based on my questions. If you have anything you want to add, I'm going to send it out to the group that has been working on this issue, and including Angela from Apartment Owners Association.
Great.
That sounds great.
Good.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. I think, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Ooh, second.
All right.
Okay.
Meeting is adjourned at 7:03 on my watch. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.